So on April 26th of 1986, just after 1:23 a.m., the number 4 reactor at Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet-era Ukraine exploded. A botched safety test, design flaws, and frantic human error combined to produce the worst nuclear accident in history. Flames shot sky high, the graphite core burned for days, and a radioactive plume drifted over Europe like a toxic bruise. In the following hours, soldiers in linen suits doused the blazing roof with shovels of sand and boron while helicopters rattled overhead. Firefighters worked without protective gear, unaware that every breath held a dose their bodies could never forget. Within 36 hours, the neighboring city home to the plant's workers was evacuated. Amusement park, bumper cars set mid-orbit, groceries half-bagged on kitchen counters. And by the time that the sarcophagus of concrete was lowered over the smoldering core, 350,000 people had been displaced. And the name Chernobyl became shorthand for catastrophe. The Soviet government drew a ragged circle 30 kilometers wide around the reactor, and they called it the exclusion zone. It is a place where Geiger counters still chirp like frantic crickets, a ghost landscape of collapsing farmhouses and moss-eaten bus stops, where birch trees push up through apartment floors. And the time frame before it's safe, well, your guess is as good as mine. Experts estimate several more human generations, while stubborn plutonium isotopes may haunt the ground for the next 24,000 years. And even then, pockets of gamma-soaked earth may remain off limits long after today's smartphones have crumbled into dust. In short, the zone teaches one bleak lesson. Here, life is not invited. Yet in this harsh zone of death, scientists have stumbled onto something that shouldn't be there: life. When researchers first re-entered the reactor number 4, they noticed velvety black smudges inching across the inner concrete. Fungus, alive and apparently delighted to call this place home. Instead of shriveling under gamma rays, the fungi seemed to bask in them. Apparently, the fungus had adapted, absorbing and, in a way, eating the radiation. It was a sort of like underground cousin to photosynthesis. The fungus had traded sunshine for fallout. And even more astonishing, those midnight black colonies, they intentionally creep towards the hottest debris like ivy towards sunlight. And studies of the fragments of the reactor's graphite moderator found fungal filaments tunneling straight into the radioactive carbon, slowly breaking it down, nature's sort of own hazmat cleanup crew. A disaster that continues to haunt humanity is being answered by organisms no thicker than a coat of paint, in a place that we have labeled as death. The story of life refuses our ending. As we wrap up our series this Sunday talking about what happened on the cross, the atonement theory that we're looking at today is a lot like that fungus that defies the death at Chernobyl. Because if the story of the Chernobyl fungus startles scientists because it reverses death into life, the moral influence theory of atonement, this view of the cross, startles in the very same way. It insists that in a place where we once only saw death and judgment, that God has instead planted an invitation to love, an invitation to live differently. Almost every other atonement theory tries to solve a problem in God. How does the offended deity get appeased? How does cosmic justice balance itself? But the moral atonement theory, by contrast, it begins with a harder omission. The real problem is not in heaven or somewhat up there going on with God, but rather the problem, the challenge, is in us. We are the ones that need to be changed. And so instead of really the resurrection or incarnation or death and brutality of the cross, it turns its focus towards our heart. And the cross is God's loudest act of persuasion, aimed at thawing the frost around our human heart. This theory, it is best known lineage. It traces back to the fiery monk named Peter Abelard. It was early in the 1100s, and Europe's prevailing spiritual mood sounded a lot like medieval courtroom. God as judge, sinners as debtors, salvation as a legal settlement. But Abelard thought that this legalese, well, it sounded nothing like the Jesus who knelt to wash feet. In his commentary on Romans, he floated a sort of different melody. He said, Christ's death is a supreme demonstration of love. And demonstrations like poetry or a standing ovation, they don't change statues, they change people. God is not the one who needed the persuading. We are. And so the genius and the scandal of the cross, Abelard wrote, is that limitless love put on human flesh and allowed humanity to do its very worst, and then looked at the executioners, looked them in the eye, and said, "Still, I love you." That sort of love cracks open even the hardest cynic. Our hearts, he argued, should be set ablaze and compelled toward him when we look at the cross. Yet in the medieval West, those softer accents were drowned out by the thunder of feudal honor codes. Abelard's commentaries called him dangerous and even sentimental, because love, in their view, needed that muscle of judgment and punishment to be taken seriously. But the seed was planted. And throughout history, this theory of what happened on the cross has continued to find new life over and over again. In short, whenever the church has sensed that fear-based religion was choking out the gospel, this moral influence theory of the cross has resurfaced like a persistent spring. And what flows in this stream, what flows in these waters, at its core, it is a two-part confession. The first is that God did not need to be talked or persuaded into loving us. As Paul says, while we were yet sinners, still sinners, Christ died for us. Father, Son, and Spirit were already one in the mission of self-giving grace long before we ever uttered a single apology. And so the cross, therefore, is not a negotiation table where God hammers out better terms. It is a billboard that reads, "This is how far love will go." Second, moral influence insists that when we stare long enough at the cross, that something shifts and changes in us. We encounter a God whose power is not found in punitive justice, but rather it is a power found in co-suffering. We see holiness. It does not recoil from the grime of humanity, but rather moves toward it. And we realize that the point was never to placate some grudge up in the sky, but the point was to awaken us on the ground. And so atonement then is less about a ledger line being cleared and more about a heart line being redrawn. From self-preservation to self-giving, from cynical resignation to active compassion. It is like the fungus that turns deadly radiation into nourishment. In the moral influence theory of atonement, Christ steps into humanity's meltdown, receives a full dose of the fallout on the cross, and somehow takes the brutality of the cross and transmutes it into a message of love. And so the question is how? How can a Roman death machine possibly heal the human heart? How can iron spikes and splintered beams reveal anything good, much less something that we would call God? These aren't rhetorical questions. They are the very questions that every generation must answer if this moral influence theory is more than just a sort of soft sediment. And so ultimately, we answer these questions by lingering beneath the cross and by recognizing just how wildly out of place it truly is. Because think of this. An execution is where empires flaunt their final say, their authority, their power. An execution is meant to freeze the imagination, to grind courage into powder. And yet Christians take this image of death and we flip it upside down. In fact, everything that happens on Good Friday is drenched in paradox. A God that we name as all-powerful bleeds on the cross. A king who could call down legions of angels chooses forgiveness while soldiers gamble for his clothes. The strength that we expect, swords and thunder and power, it gives way to a strength that will not raise a fist even to save itself. The wisdom that we expect, it gives way to a kind of holy foolishness that lets love look naive so that hardness might finally melt. What we see on the cross when we look at it, it is the full-bodied commentary of everything that Jesus taught. Because think about it, Jesus teaches by taking the things in life that we assume to be true and by flipping them upside down. Blessed are the poor. The greatest is the servant. You lose your life to find it. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. Love your enemy. In every paradox that he pronounced in Galilee, it steps on stage at Calvary and says, watch this. When nails bind Jesus to the cross, he does not rescind a single sermon point. He does not pivot to vengeance. Instead, he prays and extends forgiveness to even his executioners. And that strength, that defiance of love, a love that refuses to morph into retaliation even under torture, it strips away our religious varnish. Because we can no longer just trivialize Jesus' teachings, because when we look at Jesus on the cross, we either have to dismiss him as a fool and a fraud, or we confess him as Lord. The cross is honest about its brutality and its cruelty. It shows us just how brutal and harsh humanity can be, but it also shows us this, that God chooses to meet us in life in the places that feel most God-forsaken. And it says, you are not alone, even here. It is God taking sides with the bruised and the hurting and the victim, and by joining them, it shows that the cross is not passive, it is a protest of solidarity. The cross shatters the illusion that God watches suffering from some celestial skybox up in the sky, but it also shatters the illusion that we can remain neutral. If divine love stands with victims even when the price is death, then discipleship cannot be a spectator sport. And so the question is no longer, does God care, but it is, will I join God there? We cherish the cross not because we glorify suffering or glorify pain, but because we believe that pain is exactly what love vows to end. When we gaze at the broken body, we hear the promise that one day there will be no more crosses. But this begs the question, if the cross is meant to rewrite human hearts, then why do so many Christians look unchanged? If the cross is meant to change how we live, then why do so many people of faith look, act, and support things that are so drastically different from who Christ was? It is hard to dismiss the dissonance. Churches that sing the songs of Easter Sunday, and yet on Monday the same lips bless cruelty and embrace bigotry. Social media timelines drip with verses about grace, and then pivot seamlessly into mockery of migrants, or they shrug at the promotion of violence. And the irony is this: the scandal is not just that hypocrisy exists. Hypocrisy is as old as humanity. The irony is that it thrives inside of a community whose central symbol is the cross. Simply put, the branding don't match the product. And I believe that part of the problem is that in a weird sort of way, we have domesticated the cross. We sand it down into a keepsake thin enough to hang on a necklace. We turn it into fire insurance, and then we just go about our business. But when the cross becomes a sort of trinket, when it loses its radical protest and its non-violent strength, discipleship, well, it shrinks into brand loyalty. And so you can cheer for any policy, any pundit, anyone you want, so long as the logo remains visible. And so why are so many Christians unchanged? The blunt answer is this. It is that a lot of Christians only embrace the cross up to the point where it stops benefiting them. They glance at it and they say, "Thank you," and then they rush back to whatever it was they were doing. In a way, they stay outside of the exclusion zone and they avoid getting too close. But the cross does not work that way. Because if you look at it, if you understand it, it is like walking into a room with a grizzly bear. It ain't something you're going to be able to ignore. Moral influence theory says that the cross is supposed to recalibrate our reflexes, like the fungus converting radiation into nourishment. Our hearts convert brokenness into love. And so when power mocks the powerless, our reflex of love kicks in. When lies market themselves as truth, our reflex of love kicks in. When racism and sexism and homophobia slips into policy, our reflex should be solidarity with those who are targeted, not some theological hair splitting to protect our comfort. Which means every time believers baptize cruelty, the world is correct to feel that whiplash. Because they are measuring us by the metric that Jesus gave, love. Love is how the world identifies who the followers of Christ truly are, and love is how they distinguish who is lying. The way of the cross, then, is not something that we can trivialize or discard. The way of the cross is the way of Jesus, and if we miss that, we miss him. It's funny how the four Gospels spend surprisingly little ink, going through how the cross atones and the intricacies of theological language. But you know what? It spends an ocean of ink showing us what love looks like. They give us meals shared with sinners, children scooped into open arms, a despised Samaritan cast as a hero. They show us a Lord who washes feet and a Savior that forgives even on the cross. The life and the ministry of Jesus isn't some metaphysical diagram. It is a persistent love that aligns itself with those who are hurting. A cross-shaped, defiant love that we are called to embody because we are stewards of that love. A love that has already taken the very worst that humanity can do, and guess what? It is still here, still alive, and it is still recruiting accomplices. And so let us be those accomplices. Let us plant ourselves in the fallout zones of our time and grow something beautiful and unexplainable. Justice flavored with joy. Truth spoken with tenderness. Protest laced with hope. If a fungus no thicker than a pane of coat can turn radiation into life and nourishment, imagine what a spirit-filled people might be able to do with an entire world that is aching for resurrection. And so where does all of this leave us as we walk out the door? It leaves us face to face with the cross, not as some theological puzzle to admire from a safe distance, but as a living invitation to reshape the habits of our hearts. If we claim to follow Christ, we cannot shrug at the love that carried him to Golgotha, or pretend that that love was just a one-time performance. The cross, it exposes every short take we take, every excuse that we make, every moment that we duck behind comfort when we should be stepping out in courage. And if that exposure does not unsettle us, then we have not actually seen the cross for what it is. We have passed by an ornament, a trinket, and not stood beneath a revolution. So the takeaway is painfully simple. The same love that drove Jesus to the margins must now drive us. Because we are not called to keep the world polite. We are called to make it more Christ-like. And so, friends, may the love that led Jesus to the cross, may it be the love that leads you out of this sanctuary. And may that love find its way into every place in life that we have labeled as dead. And may it make it come back alive. Amen.